Right, so I'm very happy to welcome you today. I'm Adelina Comas-Herrera from the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, and I'm going to introduce today's webinar by telling you a little bit about the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, a bit about today, and also our forthcoming webinars. So the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care is a platform for cross-national learning on long-term care. We want to learn from research evidence and also from different experiences in different countries, and understanding how all these shared challenges in relation to care are being addressed in different parts of the world, and also how is the evidence from scientific research helping us address these challenges. It's an open platform for everyone from any background, and you're all very welcome. The way the observatory works is by supporting knowledge sharing, and we do that through our GOLTC publications. We have country profiles, we have a vibrant series of blogs where you can, of course, let people know about your own research. So do get in touch if you want to share anything. We've got methods and topic guides, and the real heart of the observatory are the interest groups that organize webinars like today's and share relevant publications and resources. And we're gradually building a database of experts, publications, research projects, and videos of webinars that you can check at any time. Today, we're going to hear about caring through social connection in care homes, the SONNET study, and the speakers will be Andrew Sommerlath and Jennifer Bethel. I'm going to hand over to them in a minute, but first I'll tell you about our next webinars. We've got one on the 31st of March on challenges faced by women in the social care workforce, looking at gender and race intersectionality in training reforms and how to take those into account. This is looking at the England context. We then have one from a topic that we're very proud to host, even if it doesn't sound like long-term care initially, but we do think it has long-term implications. So it's great to include global perinatal mental health. And this webinar on the 5th of May is going to be looking at the case for investment and economic evidence for policy research and practice using a practical cost calculator that's going to be demonstrated at this event on the 5th of May. On the 13th of May, we're going to have a webinar on defining quality incontinence care for older adults from the GOLTC Continence Care Interest Group. On the 23rd of June, we've got one looking at the complexity or orofacial pain, so that's pain to do with the face and teeth in nursing home residents and how to best support them. And then we have one on the 7th of July, which is from the quasi-experimental methods interest group that's going to be looking at the effect of private versus shared rooms on nursing home residents' health outcomes. And finally, we'd like to announce, and maybe you know already, but just in case, that we have the next international conference on evidence-based policy in long-term care, the ILPN conference. It will be held in London, 9 to 11 of September, hosted at the London School of Economics, and the call for abstracts is open until the 5th of May. So that's it from me. I'm very happy to hand over to Andrew and Jennifer.
That's great, thank you. So hopefully I can be heard by people and you can see my slides. That's great. So thank you very much, Adelina, for the introduction and for the invitation to come and join the group today. It's really nice to see so many people joining. So I'll introduce myself and my colleague Jen, who's together we'll be presenting about our study, which is called SONNET Study. I'm showing here a slide from a family member, a husband of a woman who developed dementia, and wrote a series of sonnets describing his experience of the changes in that he observed in his wife and the changes to their social relationships that was a consequence really of her developing dementia. And he was happy to share this with our study team. And I do so because our research study focuses on understanding changes in social connection in people with dementia living in care homes, and we found the acronym SONNET to describe that, and I'll describe the various different components of the study in more detail. So I'm an old age psychiatrist and a researcher at University College London. Jen, I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jennifer Bethel, and I'm a scientist at the University Health Network at the Kite Research Institute. I'm an epidemiologist by background, and I also have an appointment at the University of Toronto's Institute of Health Management, Policy and Evaluation.
Great, thank you. So, and the work that I will start talking about and Jen will continue was really proposed by Jen several years ago now. She reached out to discuss the possibility of applying to for a grant from the Alzheimer's Association and Brain Canada, presented here on the slide, who are wanting to improve approaches to measuring important patient outcomes for people with dementia. So this is a grant scheme called RCOM, and I can't remember the exact acronym. But they really wanted to try and think about ways to improve the way in which we can measure different elements. And my interest has been in thinking about social functioning in people with dementia, and Jen's experience played into that. So she suggested that we work on trying to improve the way in which social connection can be measured, and I'll explain why we think that was important. We are representing a broader team of co-investigators who are from the UK, Australia, the US, and Canada, and other staff, many of whom have gone on to do further, a few of these have gone on to do PhDs and clinical psychology training. So the team has built on the work that we've done to really work more in the field of dementia, and we were also really well supported by PPI work from a group in Canada that Jen works closely with, and from several representatives of the UK Alzheimer's Society Research Network. So in the talk today, I'll first of all talk about what is social connection and why is it important in care homes. Some of the evidence for what we know about how to build and maintain social connection in people living in care homes, and what are some of the limitations in the evidence, which we then tried to build on in the SONNET study. And Jen will talk about future work that's in process, building on the work that we did. So I'll start by defining what we meant by social connection throughout our study, which is that we use social connection really as quite a broad umbrella term to describe all aspects of human relationships and interactions. So those comprised of both what might be considered objective or very measurable constructs, which might reflect something like social isolation, and more subjective constructs like loneliness or a sense of social connectedness. So at the start of our study, or our work program, we developed this thematic sort of framework of what we thought social connection comprised of, and the more objective or observed or measurable areas like social networks and isolation are to the left, the experienced or subjective ones are to the right, and social interaction plays between all of those things. So I hope I'll try and be consistent in the terminology that I use, but this is the sort of way that we approach the topic. And of course, social connection and its various components are a really important area of health research generally. There is a global interest really in thinking about the impact of social connection on health generally, and these are just examples of some of the government reports and strategies that have focused on that. So I think the catchiest one being from the US, which describes an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. So there is this general interest throughout society in thinking about the importance of loneliness, social connection for health, but of course there is particular focus and interest on the impact of these areas in people living in care homes. So why that's particularly the case for people living in care homes are that there are clear links between elements of social connection and quality of life, clear links with mental and physical health outcomes, including, the core things like mortality. There is good evidence that more social participation and engagement is linked to better cognitive function and lower dementia risk, and is an important aspect for people living in care homes as a marker of quality of care and person-centered care. There is an importance for us to be able to study and try and improve social connection in people living in care homes. But there is good evidence that social connection, while essential, problems with social connection are common. So this is a broad estimate that loneliness might be affect between 37 and 72%. We'll talk about why that might be such a broad estimate later, but these experiences of impaired social connection or loneliness are common. And that might particularly be the case because of various elements that relate to care home residents and the care home setting. So most residents are older adults, many of whom have visual or hearing loss, cognitive impairment or mobility impairment, which makes it difficult for them to maintain social connections. Many residents receive vital social support from their existing social networks, families and friends, but some residents don't have a close existing social network who can maintain that contact. Staff provide essential support to residents, but time is limited and there might be high turnover of staff, and there is an experience, certainly from our interviews with some staff, that that areas of social connection are not prioritized in care homes because they're viewed as less pressing essential concerns than providing, physical support. So it can be difficult for staff to maintain good quality relationships. And there are specific things that relate to care homes, such as, the communal settings and the group activities that people experience that means that social connection is different in these settings. So there is some good evidence on what might help to build and maintain social connection in care homes. So previous studies have tested the effect of interventions on social connection outcomes, and those might be sort of individual level interventions like providing group psychosocial interventions like reminiscence therapy, or facilitating social contact with existing social networks through technological approaches, video calling. There's research on sort of broader characteristics that might impact the level of social connection for residents, and the figure on the right is from work that Jen did, thinking about strategies that could mitigate some of the social connection limitations that were seen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that gives us a clue about some things that might be helpful. This is another study that focused specifically on interventions in care homes for loneliness. This review described 4 kind of areas of different types of interventions that have been tested in trials in care homes. And you can see there, so grouped together, there were trials of what were sort of animal-assisted therapies. So people might be familiar with the sort of robotic animals that can be used in care homes, like the Paro robot seal that can be passed around care home residents, or real animals coming in to visit care homes, in group settings, and those have been quite extensively evaluated, and there's some evidence that people report lower loneliness following those sort of interventions, but the acceptability varied, particularly according to whether people, people's pre-existing experience of animals. The evidence for that is quite mixed. Group activities of the type that I mentioned earlier, like cognitive training or reminiscence, didn't consistently have a beneficial impact on loneliness. Digital technologies enabling contact of residents with their existing networks were associated in a few studies with lower loneliness, and some are particular, the person-centered care using Eden philosophy hasn't been shown to be effective. So there is really quite mixed findings, and I don't think a very clear research consensus on what's most beneficial. And this is partly because interpreting the research evidence is challenging. Studies often have quite short follow-up, so it's evaluate the short-term impact of these sort of interventions on areas like loneliness. So it's unclear whether interventions have a lasting effect. The terminology that's used, as I described earlier, can be quite inconsistent or ambiguous. So it's the measurement and the wide range of measurement of loneliness might partly be because loneliness has been inconsistently measured in different studies. And it's difficult then to also measure this in intervention studies, and this partly reflects that measures of social connection or its components haven't been tested or developed for a care home setting. So there isn't a clear consensus or gold standard approach to how we should measure social connection in care home settings for research. So this was the gap that we wanted to fill with our research, was to try and improve the way in which we can measure social connection. So the SONNET study aimed to develop a new valid measure of social connection for care home residents. We wanted it to be suitable for research settings, for research use primarily, so that could be for observational or for interventional research, and for it to also potentially have utility in real-world settings, in care homes and clinical settings on the ground. So we did this through 3 linked projects addressing these research questions, and we'll talk briefly about each of these. So the first was to do a systematic review, understanding what existing measures have been used to assess social connection in care homes and what are the psychometric properties of those measures. The second was to do qualitative interviews with care home residents, families, clinicians and staff and researchers to understand what are the important elements of social connection for care home residents. So that would help tell us what we should then include in Aim 3, the development and testing of a new measure, where we would then test whether it could adequately assess social connection among care home residents. So this figure is going to recur throughout the presentation to try and show the kind of structure of the study. So we did the sort of systematic review and our qualitative interviews alongside each other, took the evidence from both of those into the development of our measure, took the measure back to relevant stakeholders to refine it, and then finally into Aim 3's psychometric testing. And I should say, sort of now all of these studies have now been completed and published. So there will be links for the papers throughout. So I'll describe briefly, first of all, Aim 1, our systematic review. So we've described this as being a review in 2 parts. We looked across 8 databases until 2022 when we completed our search for studies which looked for psychometric properties of social connection measures in care home residents. So for those who are not familiar, psychometric properties refers to really, in general, the accuracy of a questionnaire or scale or instrument for how accurately it can measure that particular construct. And it has those different components, which I'll talk about more throughout the talk. So we found, we searched the databases. I think we found something like 8,000 studies that we needed to work through. And with the studies that we eventually refined those papers down to, which ended up being about 80 or so papers. We did two things. The first was to do a COSMIN review. So this is using the COSMIN methodology, the link is at the bottom, to produce a detailed inventory of the measures and what the psychometric properties from previous research was. So I'll describe this in more detail, but really understanding how accurately all of those measures have been shown to be. And then a content analysis, so to pick out each of the items within each of the measures and describe and categorize those, so understand how the different measures, what they set out, and what they set out specifically to measure. So because this concept of social connection is quite broad, we wanted to try and refine that down and see really what each measure was assessing. So this was prospectively registered and then completed over quite a painstaking period, led by our research assistants and fellows. I won't go into these different areas in detail really, but to say that the two reviews, the first, the COSMIN review, asked us to use the COSMIN methodology to evaluate the quality of each study, and then pull those, each study that had looked, one particular measure might have had several studies that assessed its psychometric properties, and we kind of pulled those together to get an overall grading of the accuracy of each measure. And then the content analysis was a sort of, use this framework method where we picked out each item and tried to categorize those in detail, and hopefully the results, which I'll show, will describe that in clearer detail. So I've said 8,000 studies. We found 38 measurement instruments which had been evaluated across in multiple studies. So some of the key things to say are that of those 38 instruments, very few of them, about a third of them were developed for people with dementia. So often they weren't developed with people with cognitive impairment, who of course are very common in care home settings. They weren't developed with that group in mind. Many of them measured a related concept like quality of life or well-being, and only had one or two items or a subscale which focused on social connection. So again, they didn't think about social connection in detail. 17 of them were trying to specifically target some aspect of social connection. The list of the measures is on the right, and I suppose that's really just to show that many of these are looking at, like the ones at the bottom, at quality of life, or other scales that were looking at well-being, some of the ones in the middle. So Neha led the COSMIN review, and the link should be accessible to the paper, should be accessible there. And in going through the 38 scales, what we found is that there was very little high quality evidence on the psychometric properties of those 38 scales. So, for example, only 4 of them had sufficient evidence of their construct validity, how accurately they were assessing that element of social connection. And none of the measures demonstrated satisfactory psychometric properties on all of these aspects, which is what COSMIN would like in order for a scale to be recommended for use. So we could say that none of those could be currently recommended for use. The majority of them, there wasn't evidence that they were poor quality, so they fit into that group where they have potential to be recommended if there was further research to assess their quality, and only a few of them were specifically not recommended because there was sufficient evidence that they were inaccurate in their measurement. So I think that really just emphasizes that the research on measurement of social connection in care home residents has been really quite sparse, and it clearly, we felt, left the gap that we wanted to fill by developing and testing in better detail a new measure. The second element of the review, as I've described, was the content analysis, and this is listed. So the link there, led by Adelina. So I think some of the key things really to say are that the majority of the measures which set out to measure some aspect of social connection actually measured several different elements of the of social connection based on the framework that I showed earlier on. Those are listed here. So a scale might measure some element of both social isolation, but also an element of loneliness, for example. And so if you took the scale as a whole, then you would be looking at different components of social connection, and you wouldn't really be able to be very specific about what you're assessing. So again, I think we took this to suggest that it was very important in developing a scale to identify which of these different kind of blue elements of social connection was most important, and then focus the development of the scale on those particular areas. So I'll move on now to the next element in describing the qualitative interviews that we conducted with our residents and staff and family members. So Hannah, who was working with us at UCL, did a detailed analysis of our qualitative data, and the paper is there. But to describe the methods in briefly, we recruited residents with and without dementia. About half of the residents had dementia, family and friend caregivers, and care home staff members and clinicians for qualitative interviews, or for the clinicians we did focus groups. We asked the participants about their views on key aspects of social connection. What did they think were the most important elements of social connection for residents? And also, what do they think about kind of best approaches to measuring this? And then we used a thematic analysis, 6-step approach to analyze the data and categorize it. We spoke to 67 participants in total, split across those different groups, and Hannah's review suggested these different elements, which were kind of key drivers of good quality social connection for care home residents. So this is that the participants told us that, you know, helping residents to settle in and become familiar with life in the home when they moved into the care home was particularly important. So, you know, avoiding residents feeling institutionalized by linking them with their previous interests and trying to break down barriers between sort of staff and residents. Things like improving freedom of mobility around the care home so that there was the opportunity to interact with different people. There's the theme on physical and virtual access beyond the care home, which included thinking about facilitating outings, providing support with technology to link people with their existing social networks. There's the theme about getting to know residents and deepening relationships through that, which is really about learning about the individual and their previous interests, and using family and friends to provide some of that knowledge, and fostering relationships between residents with shared interests. And the final point is around kind of maybe more general elements that reflect something around care home culture. So, you know, a care home valuing the importance of social connection and understanding psychosocial needs, making use of communal spaces, and yeah, making some of those adjustments at the care home level. So these interviews told us a lot about what might be important to try and improve social connection, and it, crucially for the development of our scale, it also told us what residents thought was most important, really, which is the sort of good quality relationships between residents and their other residents and staff, the opportunity to engage in activities inside and outside the care home, and also you know, the key sort of subjective elements of experiencing social connectedness with other residents. So we took those things as the areas that we really wanted to focus our development of the measure and psychometric testing. So the figure here describes that in more detail, but having completed our development of the model and review and also our qualitative interviews, we took the information that we learned into step 3, generating a long list of items that we thought might make it into our scale. We tested that in initial pilot testing and refined the scale, and then we went into a 2-stage testing of the different properties of the scale, which I'll describe. So I mentioned at the end of the qualitative interviews, we had an idea that we really wanted to focus on social engagement and social connectedness as the two key areas of social connection that we thought that residents thought were most important. We wanted to make sure that our new scale that we were developing had the opportunity to be completed by residents themselves, but also considering residents' cognitive or other communication difficulties. We wanted the opportunity that we could get data from care home staff via proxy report, and we left open the possibility that we might ask staff or proxies different questions to the questions that we would ask residents, and we wanted to think about making the scale person-centered, so mitigating some of the problems that residents with dementia would experience with their memory, their attention, or their language. So we were kind of guided by the Alzheimer's Association's PC-MET tool, which thought about how to maximize person-centered measurement. As I said, we developed a long list of 70 questions based on our interviews and some of the kind of best performing items from other scales. And then we reduced this to 20 through discussion amongst our research team, and also crucially discussions with our PPI groups and some initial piloting. So we removed mostly redundant items and ones that people felt weren't completely relevant to get a medium version of our scale, our 20-item scale, which we took into an initial phase of testing. So this is an example. This is a screenshot of an example of the kind of final version of the scale, just to show some of the kind of some of the items. The scale is accessible via the website here, and I'll have a link for it later on. But we asked, this is the resident rated version. There's a script that can be used at the start of the interview in the top left of the screen, and then we would ask residents to answer ultimately 12 questions about different aspects of their relationships. So asking them how they enjoyed the company of other residents, and we had a consistent set of response options so that people weren't having to shift between different types of responses. And then you can see actually here that these different questions fit into the 2 different subscales that we created. So the first 4 questions here relate to our social engagement scale, and the ones at the end, which are whether people felt like they had things in common with other residents or whether they consider other residents to be friends, links to the social connectedness subscale. So we did this 2-phase testing, as I mentioned. So first of all, we had developed this 20-item long version of the scale, and we took it to 111 resident care staff dyads in the UK and Canada. So we had care home residents who they really just needed to be over 65 and needed to be able to speak English because we were at this stage we only had an English version of the scale, and we really wanted residents to reflect the general population of care home residents. So we tried to recruit we were aiming for around 2/3 of residents to have dementia, which is reflective of the care home population in UK and Canada, and we did achieve that overall. And residents had to have a proxy rater who could answer questions about the resident, and we recruited from a large number of care homes in the UK and in Canada. So after taking our scale to the 111 residents, we did some initial testing of the range of responses and exploratory factor analysis to help us refine the scale down, the 20-item scale down to a 12-item scale, which we then took into our final stage of testing, and that's the one that I'll focus on now. That was with 52 resident proxy dyads, and this is what we did with them. We all residents, well, consent was provided either by themselves or if they lacked mental capacity by a consultee. Every resident we tried to, in an initial face-to-face visit, obtain their demographic details and ask them to respond to the 12 SONNET scale questions. And from the proxy raters, we did the same, the demographics, and asked them to complete the proxy rated version of the scale, and also to rate several other scales which assess different elements that we thought would be related to our SONNET scale. For as many as possible, immediately afterwards, a second researcher went back into the room to ask residents to complete the SONNET scale again, or the proxy to do so, which was to test its inter-rater reliability. And again, similarly, for as many as we could, we went back 2 weeks later for one of those researchers to apply the scale again to think about its test-retest reliability. And all respondents were given a voucher to thank them for their time. These are the participant characteristics in brief, which is from the 52 residents. The average age was 85. As you can see, roughly 2/3 had dementia. We had a slightly higher number of women than men, a small number of people from minority ethnic groups. And we have 38 raters. That's because some staff raters rated multiple residents, and you can see that the staff members on average were 43. By far the majority were women, reflecting the care home population. A larger proportion were from minority ethnic groups. So to talk now about the main results, I'll split that into different sections. So to talk about the acceptability and feasibility of our scale, we found that we think it's an acceptable duration. So the scale took on average 8 minutes for residents to complete, 4 minutes for staff to complete, which certainly for a research scale is quite reasonable. We looked to see how many missing responses we had, and the numbers here are not quite right. I think they're right for staff raters. So we had a very small number of missing responses from staff. 1% of all responses were missing. Residents, that was more common. Some of our residents with severe dementia who were non-verbal couldn't answer any questions, but we did expect that. And what we also wanted to think about was what would be called the floor or ceiling effect. So was there, were we getting a good range of responses on each of our questions? And that was seen for most questions. So we think it's acceptable and feasible for people to complete in general. We did a confirmatory factor analysis, which supported the idea that our 12 questions fitted into these 2 subscales, the one focused on engagement, and I've shown some examples of those already, and a subscale focused on social connectedness. So we suggest that the SONNET scale comprises those 2 components and they should be treated separately, and so the rest of the results will treat the 2 separately. These are just the raw scores from our data. Residents on the social engagement scale, you can see they report, average scores and a range of different scores across the resident ratings and the proxy ratings for the 2 subscales. I suppose we were interested to see to what extent there was a correlation between residents' ratings of their own social engagement and the staff member rating of that resident's social engagement. And you can see that the correlation is what would be described as moderate for the social engagement scale and weak for the social connectedness scale. So there is not huge agreement between residents and staff, and we're still really trying to understand that, but some of that is accounted for by the fact when we split the group into people who who were less cognitively impaired, the quality of, or the correlation between resident and staff rating was a lot better, 0.5, compared to the most cognitively impaired people where there was a poor correlation. So it might partly be that some residents who are more cognitively impaired find it difficult to rate their own social engagement accurately, but that doesn't seem to be the story for the social connectedness subscale. So this is something that does need to be taken into account, really. I'm happy to discuss that more, but I'll move on to discussing the reliability of the scale. So this is reflecting inter-rater and test-retest reliability for the resident rated scale in blue and the proxy rated scale in orange. I suppose focusing on the proxy rated scale on the right, ratings were very consistent, but when two different researchers collected the data on the same day at the top, the inter-rater reliability, and pretty consistent when the same researcher came back 2 weeks later. So this would certainly be considered adequate reliability. Those reliability correlations are lower for the resident rated scale, which again, I think we might expect partly due to the impact of cognitive impairment, but also perhaps the the day-to-day experience of residents is inherently more variable. And then in the last moment, I'll just talk about the contract validity. So this is how we viewed whether our scale ratings, how they correlated with other scales, which we hypothesized would be related. So again, looking on the right, the social engagement subscale was quite closely correlated with the RISE, which is a brief assessment of social engagement, which is in use in US and Canadian care homes, and also with a social subscale from the QAL-AD scale. There were kind of expected negative correlations with some other things like dementia severity and neuropsychiatric symptoms. More neuropsychiatric symptoms meant worse social engagement. So again, most of our hypothesized correlations were seen, albeit to a weaker degree in the resident rated scale. Well, interestingly, we didn't see any correlation really with the activities of daily living ability. Okay, so I'll finish there really just by saying that I hope that the talk so far has suggested that social connection is essential for care home residents. It contributes to better mental and physical health and cognition. It reflects good quality of care. But we know relatively little about research evidence for interventions to improve social connection, which is partly because of the challenges of measuring this. So through our SONNET study, we think we have tried to conceptualize social connection in better detail and listed the quality of previous measures. And crucially, our new scale, which is available for others to use, is certainly acceptable, and there's preliminary evidence of its validity and reliability for use in care homes. Things that we know need to happen are some more detailed analysis of its psychometric properties, like responsiveness over time, and some of those studies are in process. We're interested in thinking about applying the scale in samples which have a wider variation in participants from minority ethnic groups. And thinking about extending its potential use to other cultures and languages through adaptation and translation and validation of the scale, which leads me to pass on to Jen, who will discuss that in more detail.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And I enjoyed listening to the past few years of our lives flash before my eyes. So thank you for doing such a great job reporting on the SONNET study. So as Andrew mentioned, we really wanted this measure to be useful and have utility in real world settings. And so part of that is really thinking about how to include it or to develop it for application in non-English speaking settings. And certainly one thing I learned as an epidemiologist through the process, each of these 7 steps on the slide in front of you, is how important every single word is in any sort of measure, but certainly in a measure of social connection for nursing homes. And so with that in mind, really thinking about if there's going to be a translation and an adaptation to different settings, how important it was to do this work with the intensity and that we, I guess, put into the past 3 or 4 years. So you've seen this slide already where Andrew's talked through each of the 7 or 6 steps rather that we went through to develop the measure in the first place. So now I'm sort of adding step 7 on as translation and cultural adaptation. And one thing I did not mention in my introduction is that I'm not in Canada at the moment. I'm actually in the town of Lleida, Spain, living my best life, but also translating and adapting this measure of social connection to Spanish and Catalan. Next slide, please. So I pulled a quote from a paper, which I think sort of sums it up. It's this idea of a poorly translated instrument threatens the validity of research data and the safe aggregation of global data sets. So as an epidemiologist, my dream is that this measure of social connection would be integrated into, national data sets or international data sets. And so to do this well is so important. You can't build a house out of styrofoam, and so having a good quality measure is really crucial. So going back to this paper published in 2005, which I reviewed on the flight on my way over, and it talks through this 10-step process. And of course, step 1 starts with preparing yourself, and step 10 produces a final report. And there's rules within this process for in-country consultants. So certainly I'm not Catalan or Spanish, and so how I would write or translate this instrument would certainly not do it justice. So working with a team of people in the country, I'm the instrument developer, we had translators, and actually tomorrow we're doing cognitive interviews in a residencia here in Lleida. Next slide, please. Oh, Andrew, do you mind? Sorry. But also, sorry, go back one. I'll be quick. In the meantime, so since arriving here in Lleida, there's been a paper published and on asking about this idea of using AI for translations. And so my first thought is you couldn't possibly, because really the nuance couldn't be captured by artificial intelligence. It would require real intelligence from real translators. But of course, there's this counterbalance of time and efficiency. Why not? It would be quicker, it would be faster, and literally it takes less than a second to do it. So there's this very helpful paper, I've put the image up on the screen, that talks through a process where you sort of try and get the best of both worlds. Next slide. And I won't talk you through every single step except to say that, it has the same steps involving dual forward translation. So from English into Catalan, a reconciliation. So you do the 2 translations, you reconcile the 2 versions, you translate it back to English, you make sure that the original intent is still there, you harmonize and finalize, and then you do these cognitive interviews to make sure they're understandable, interpretable, relevant in the context here in Lleida, in Spanish and Catalan. Next slide. So all this to say, we'd welcome more opportunities to adapt and make this a measure that we can use globally, but also now to acknowledge the fabulous study team that we've been working with over the past few years, and of course, funding from Alzheimer's Association in Brain Canada. And Andrew, ARCOM stands for Advancing Research on Care and Outcome Measurement. How could we forget? So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to acknowledge the wonderful colleagues and certainly the people with lived experience who got involved in our project and made sure we stay focused on these ideas of social engagement and connectedness. And I guess we have time for questions now.
Yes, you do. And I don't know if you stop sharing to see if there's any hands going up.
Yeah, that's great. Willem.
So I think, William, yeah.
Hi, yeah, I work in aged care in South Africa. I'm also the representative of the Eden Alternative in South Africa. So it's really wonderful to see this research. And it's really encouraging to see that this research is being done and affirming what we see on the ground. I would love to apply your questionnaire to the South African setting and see what results we can get. Because it is loneliness is still very, very prevalent in a lot of the homes because of the institutional model. So yeah, I'm just really grateful that this research exists and that it's affirming our challenges on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, really, I mean, would be very happy to discuss the possibility of extending and applying. The scale is available for anybody to use, but we're certainly also happy to give advice and be involved in any future work with it. And I was interested in your comment in the chat about the sort of experience of residents with dementia and those without co-residing, which certainly was a theme from some of our qualitative interviews. I have a good memory of conducting one with a staff member who talked about, those more cognitively, less cognitively impaired people, in some cases shunning those who were more cognitively impaired, and obviously the challenge of that is potentially beneficial to have a mixed experience because people can
Absolutely.
can help one another, but also a problem in some cases.
Yeah, it's interesting how they would refer to each other as old people, but not to themselves.
Yeah. It also it reminds me really of the importance that lots of residents placed on the relationships with staff, who again I think they often see as young people.
Yes.
And I'm clearly it's the case that staff are not will have a different quality of relationship with them, will be sharper, able to remember more, will use humor in a different way with some residents, and that's viewed as being really important for residents in a way that sometimes, as you say, they might sort of self-stigmatize or stigmatize other residents.
Yes.
And we found that theme coming up in Canada as well. And in fact, I'm aware of a group, though, that supports residents through their residents' councils. And they're actually developing a training program on dementia for residents. So to teach residents about how to, understand their co-residents with dementia and also help provide social support with them as well.
That's very interesting. I don't know if you've noticed there's a question in the chat from Joseph Young asking if the SONNET scale can be applicable to people with dementia living in the community and whether you've thought about that.
Yeah, I feel like Andrew should answer I'll start and then he'll finish this off. But we developed this questionnaire very specifically for care homes because care homes have these very particular social lives. And so they have programming, they have staff, you have daily interactions with staff, and families are not living in the home. They are, described as essential care partners or visitors, but they don't live in the home. So the way we worded every item and the way we had proxies for staff respond, it was really very focused on care homes. However, Andrew, maybe you want to speak about SFDEM.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing to say is that it might be suitable for other communal residential settings, I suppose. The terminology will differ, but it might be that sheltered accommodation kind of settings where there is that communal experience might be suitable. Yeah, we have the social functioning and dementia scale, which we developed several years ago, which is, which was designed to think about community dwelling people with dementia. So I will take the liberty of linking to that here as well, in case that one is of interest, because that might well be relevant for residents living in a more general setting.
We have also a question from Leonid Polishuk, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, on whether a lack of connection to those outside the care home can be substituted by connection engagement with other residents of the same home.
Yeah, but so it's a difficult question, and I don't think we really know the answer. Um, uh, truly whether it can substitute. It's a great point, but I'm sure that residents who don't have the who don't have existing networks are going to benefit from the networking connection that can happen within the care home. Something is absolutely going to be better than nothing. I think, certainly from speaking to residents, they, of course, they hugely value the existing connection that they have with people. Jen, I don't know if you have anything to expand.
No, I don't think so.
And we've got another one asking, so you have to be brief because we don't have a lot of time. That questions. One is, have you had feedback on how the scale has helped people make really positive changes to improve social connection? Any good news stories emerging from using this so far?
Not yet that I can think of, but the paper was just published, I would say, in the past 3 weeks. So hopefully we'll have some great news stories soon. And as I said, I mean, ideally the best case scenario would be it would be used in research, but also ongoing data collection, like how do we talk about the quality of long-term care homes? And this would be one of the aspects that we would think about. So we don't have any, at least that I can think of, but maybe Andrew, you got one in mind. But good news stories is but we've certainly got colleagues using the measure in their research studies, so it'll be exciting to see those come out.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, one of the things that we had wondered about was, the potential of a scale like this being embedded within existing data that happens within care homes, and I would be really interested in people's thoughts about that. I realize, an additional administrative burden for a care home to apply the scale to all of their residents on multiple occasions is clearly not wanted by, well, it is probably not wanted by lots of care homes because they're, time pressured already. But, I think we have the thought about adapting the scale, operationalizing it so that it can be embedded within existing data collections settings. It would need to be an online kind of data collection that could be done kind of quite routinely. And I mean, I think the question does suggests, just the idea that asking about these things is going to make a difference, which I absolutely think, agree with that principle.
And the final question I think we'll have time for is from Janani Govindan Bhupati, and that's asking, how do we ensure cross-cultural validity when comparing data across countries?
That's a great question. And so I think what we need to do right now, we're in the phase of cognitive interviews to make sure the questions make sense and the measure makes sense. But following on that, there's some very specific methods that I'm certain I will need to brush up on in terms of comparing the data and comparing the structure of the data across different settings. And so I think we will, what I'm hoping is we'll return to YEDA or somewhere and be able to start collecting data on residents to start being able to look at those international differences with the measure.
And I think I'll just now wrap up a bit, but I'd like to say that if you can use our mailbox if you want to express any interest from any other countries in terms of adapting and translating the measure. I don't know if that's something that maybe the authors would be interested in. And I'd like to say thank you very much from the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. We'd be delighted to follow your progress. So we'd love to check in with you again. And please, going to the authors, do share any new publications. We'll be very happy to continue to sharing your excellent work and in advancing in this area. So thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you.